The story begins in a modest home on the outskirts of a bustling city. The protagonist, an 11-year-old black girl named Amara, lives with her father, Thomas, and her new stepmother, Evelyn. Amara's life has been anything but simple. Her mother, Lila, a vibrant and loving woman, left the family when Amara was just 6 years old to marry someone else in a distant city. The pain of her absence remains fresh in Amara's heart. Even after 5 years, Thomas, a diligent and kind man, worked tirelessly to ensure his daughter never felt unloved. However, as years passed, he sought companionship and stability, which led him to Evelyn. Evelyn, a fair-skinned woman with piercing blue eyes and an air of sophistication, entered their lives with an aura of charm that quickly won Thomas over. But for Amara, something about Evelyn felt wrong. From the start, Evelyn's relationship with Amara was distant, masked under a thin veil of politeness. Thomas, blinded by his affection for Evelyn, insisted she would bring happiness to their home. Give her time, he often told Amara, brushing off her concerns. But deep inside, Amara felt an unease that she couldn't quite articulate. Evelyn's true nature began to surface in small, calculated ways. It started with dismissive comments. "Amara, your hair looks unkempt again," Evelyn would say, her tone laced with condescension. "It's important to present yourself well, especially as a young lady." Amara would shrink under Evelyn's gaze, fiddling with the ends of her braids. Thomas, oblivious, would laugh it off. "She's just being a kid, Evelyn." But these moments escalated. Evelyn took control of the household, asserting herself in ways that subtly excluded Amara. She would serve Thomas lavish meals but leave Amara with leftovers, claiming she needed to learn not to waste food. She rearranged the house, removing photos of Lila and replacing them with her own trinkets. The message was clear. This was her home now. Amara began to notice how Evelyn's behavior shifted when Thomas wasn't around. Her stepmother's smile disappeared, replaced by a cold, hard stare. Evelyn would assign Amara tedious chores, often ensuring she failed so she could scold her. One evening, as Amara was scrubbing the kitchen floor, Evelyn leaned over her, her voice low and menacing. "You think your father loves you more than me? He doesn't. He's mine now. You're just in the way." The words hit Amara like a slap. For the first time, she saw the extent of Evelyn's malice despite Evelyn's growing cruelty. Amara found solace in her bond with her father. Thomas adored his daughter, often telling her bedtime stories and encouraging her to pursue her dreams of becoming an artist. He proudly displayed her drawings on the refrigerator, often joking, "We've got a future Picasso in the house." One night, after a particularly harsh day with Evelyn, Amara sat with her father under the stars in their backyard. "Daddy, do you miss Mommy?" she asked, her voice trembling. Thomas sighed, pulling her close. "I do, sweetheart, but life moves on, people change, and we have to find happiness where we can." Amara hesitated, wanting to tell him about Evelyn's treatment, but his tired face, worn from long days of work, stopped her. She didn't want to add to his burden. Instead, she leaned into his warmth, vowing silently to protect him. One afternoon, as Amara played quietly in her room, she overheard Evelyn on a phone call. The muffled conversation piqued her curiosity. "I can't wait much longer," Evelyn hissed. "He's too trusting. It'll be quick, and no one will suspect a thing." Amara's heart pounded in her chest. Who was Evelyn talking about? What couldn't she wait for? Peering out her door, Amara saw Evelyn pacing in the living room, a sly smile on her face. When Evelyn hung up, she turned toward the kitchen and began preparing dinner. Amara tiptoed behind her, watching as Evelyn opened a small vial and poured its contents into a glass of water. Her hands trembled as she set the glass on the counter. Fear gripped Amara. She had to know what was in that vial. Amara's attempts to warn her father about Evelyn's cruelty were met with frustration. Thomas, ever the optimist, refused to believe his wife capable of malice. "She's trying to help you, Amara," he said one evening after Evelyn complained about her laziness. "You had to give her a chance." But Amara couldn't shake her growing fear. Evelyn's behavior became bolder. One morning, while preparing breakfast, she accidentally spilled scalding coffee near Amara's hand. Another time, she left cleaning chemicals within reach of Amara's favorite art supplies, ruining her drawings. The final straw came when Amara found Evelyn in her room, rifling through her belongings. "Just tidying up," Evelyn said with a smirk. But her eyes betrayed her intent. Amara knew she was running out of time. Whatever Evelyn was planning, it was dangerous. And her father was in the center of it all. The chapter ends with Amara taking a bold step. Late at night, she sneaks into the kitchen to examine the vial Evelyn had used earlier. Holding it up to the moonlight, she notices a faint warning on the label: toxic, not for human consumption. Her breath catches as she realizes the horrifying truth. Evelyn is trying to kill her father. Tears streaming down her face, Amara clenches the vial in her hand and whispers to herself, "I won't let her hurt him. Not ever." The stage is set for Amara's fight to uncover the truth and protect her father from the danger lurking within their home. Amara was a child of contrasts. Her smile, radiant and full of life, often hid the storms brewing inside her. Her life was a delicate balance between the warmth of her father's love and the sharp sting of her mother's absence. Her father, Thomas, worked as a mechanic at a local garage. His hands often blackened with grease but his heart full of gold. He was her rock, her protector, but even rocks erode under relentless pressure. Evelyn came into their lives during what Thomas believed was a stroke of good fortune. She was polished, graceful, and seemed to breathe life into their home with her mere presence. Amara watched from the sidelines as her father laughed more and seemed happier than she had seen him in years. But for all her outward charm, Evelyn's eyes carried a coldness that sent shivers down Amara's spine. "She's beautiful, isn't she, sweetheart?" Thomas asked Amara one evening. His face lit up as they prepared dinner together. Amara, stirring the pot of stew, gave a non-committal shrug. "I guess she'll make us a real family again," Thomas added, oblivious to Amara's hesitation. Amara wanted to believe him, but deep down, she felt like Evelyn wasn't bringing their family together, she was replacing it in the beginning. Evelyn's cruelty was subtle enough to seem accidental. A forgotten birthday gift, a condescending smile, or an exaggerated sigh when Amara entered the room. At first, Amara told herself she was imagining it, but the moments accumulated like shards of broken glass, cutting deeper each time. One morning, Evelyn prepared breakfast for Thomas but left Amara's plate bare. "Oh, I thought you weren't hungry," she said with a saccharine smile when Amara sat down. "I didn't say that," Amara replied, confused. Evelyn waved dismissively. "Next time, speak up, darling. A young lady should learn to communicate." Thomas chuckled awkwardly, brushing it off as a misunderstanding. But Amara saw the smirk Evelyn threw her way when he wasn't looking. It wasn't just the little things. Evelyn seemed to have an uncanny ability to make Amara feel small. During one of Thomas's rare days off, they decided to have a family game night. Amara was thrilled, until Evelyn turned it into a subtle competition. "Let's play trivia," Evelyn suggested, pulling out a board game. "It'll be fun." But the questions she chose seemed designed to highlight what Amara didn't know. "Oh, you don't know that?" Evelyn would say with a mock surprised expression. "I suppose they don't teach much history these days." Thomas laughed it off, patting Amara's shoulder. "Don't worry, kiddo, you'll get the next one." But Amara didn't. Evelyn made sure of it despite Evelyn's actions. The bond between Amara and her father was unbreakable. Thomas made time for Amara no matter how exhausted he was after work. He was the one who taught her how to ride a bike, how to cook simple meals, and how to find constellations in the night sky. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner with Evelyn, Thomas took Amara out to the porch. They sat in their usual spot, the wooden bench creaking under their weight. Thomas pointed to the sky. "See that one? That's Orion, the hunter." Amara squinted. "Why is he hunting?" Thomas chuckled. "Maybe he's protecting something important. Like you and me, right?" Amara smiled weakly, her heart swelling with love for her father. She wanted to tell him everything, that Evelyn wasn't who she pretended to be. But how could she shatter his happiness? How could she tell him that the woman he loved didn't love him back? Amara's suspicions of Evelyn deepened one Sunday afternoon. She was sketching in her room when she heard Evelyn's voice, sharp and hushed, coming from the living room. Curiosity piqued. Amara tiptoed to the door, pressing her ear against it. "He's so naive," Evelyn was saying. "It'll be over soon. No one will question it." Amara's heart raced. Was she talking about her father? She peeked through a crack in the door and saw Evelyn pacing with her phone pressed to her ear. Her movements were jittery, and her voice carried an edge of impatience. "When?" Evelyn snapped. "I told you. It has to be soon. I can't stand another week of this." Amara pulled back, her hands trembling. What was Evelyn planning, and who was she talking to? Over the next few days, Amara kept a close watch on Evelyn. Her stepmother's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She started locking the kitchen cabinets and keeping her handbag close, as if hiding something. One evening, as Amara was cleaning up after dinner, she noticed Evelyn lingering in the kitchen long after everyone else had left. Amara peeked around the corner and saw Evelyn pouring a clear liquid from a small vial into a glass of water. She swirled it gently, her lips curling into a satisfied smile. Amara's stomach churned. She waited until Evelyn left the room before sneaking in and examining the vial. The label was faint, but the word, toxic, stood out like a scream. The glass of water was meant for her father. That night, Amara couldn't sleep. Her mind raced with questions. Should she confront Evelyn? Tell her father? Would he even believe her? She thought of the way he always defended Evelyn, dismissing Amara's concerns as childish misunderstandings. She knew she needed proof. The next morning, Evelyn served breakfast with her usual cheer. Here's your water, dear, she said, handing Thomas the glass. Amara's heart pounded as she watched her father reach for it. Without thinking, she darted forward and knocked the glass out of his hand. It shattered on the floor, water spilling everywhere. Amara, Thomas exclaimed. What on earth? I'm sorry, Amara stammered. It was an accident. Evelyn's eyes bore into Amara, her jaw tightening, but she quickly plastered on a smile. It's fine. Accidents happen. Amara knew Evelyn wasn't fooled. And now, Evelyn knew Amara was watching that night. As the house fell silent, Amara sat on her bed clutching her sketchbook. She had drawn a picture of her family, her father smiling, herself holding his hand, and a shadowy figure looming behind them. Tears blurred the lines of the drawing. I won't let her hurt him, she whispered to herself, her voice steady despite the fear in her heart. I'll protect him, no matter what. Outside her room, Evelyn stood in the hallway, her shadow stretching across the floor. Her lips curled into a sinister smile. She knew Amara was onto her, and she wasn't going to let a little girl ruin her plans. Evelyn's actions began to take a toll on the once harmonious bond between Thomas and Amara. Evelyn had a knack for subtly twisting situations to make Amara appear disobedient or disrespectful. One morning, Amara woke to the sound of raised voices in the kitchen. Rushing down, she found Evelyn sitting at the table, tears streaming down her face, while Thomas stood beside her, his arms crossed. What's going on? Amara asked, her voice shaky. Evelyn looked up, her face the picture of hurt. I didn't want to say anything, but Amara's been stealing from my jewelry box. What? Amara's mouth fell open. I didn't. Evelyn found her bracelet under your bed. Sweetheart, Thomas said, his voice stern but calm. Do you have anything to say about that? It wasn't me, Amara protested. She's lying. I don't even go into her room. Amara, Thomas sighed, rubbing his temples. This isn't like you. Just apologize. Amara's heart broke as she saw the disappointment in her father's eyes. She turned to Evelyn, who gave her a triumphant smirk the moment Thomas wasn't looking. I didn't take it, she said softly, tears stinging her eyes. I swear. But Thomas had already turned away, and Evelyn's false narrative took root. Amara realized that Evelyn was not only targeting her but also planting seeds of doubt in her father's mind. Though Amara felt powerless, she wasn't willing to surrender. She began observing Evelyn more closely, keeping a small notebook where she documented every suspicious action, from Evelyn's locked drawers to her secret phone calls. Amara noted it all. One day, as Evelyn left the house to run errands, Amara saw an opportunity. She snuck into Evelyn's bedroom, her heart racing. The room was immaculate, with everything meticulously placed, a stark contrast to Amara's own cluttered space filled with sketches and books. She went straight to the bedside table, where she had once seen Evelyn tuck away a small key. It was still there. Using the key, she unlocked a drawer and found a small black notebook. Flipping through its pages, Amara's blood ran cold. There were detailed notes about Thomas's work schedule, finances, and even his medical history. One page had a chilling entry: his heart medication, potentially lethal with the right mixture. Amara's hands shook as she snapped photos of the pages with her phone. Before she could examine more, she heard the front door creak open. Quickly locking the drawer, she slipped out of the room and back into her own, her heart pounding in her chest. That evening, Evelyn's facade began to crack further. During dinner, She made snide comments about Amara's school performance. Your teacher mentioned you've been falling behind. Didn't she? Thomas. Maybe we need to consider a tutor. Someone to straighten her out. Thomas frowned. Amara's smart. She doesn't need straightening out. Amara shot Evelyn a defiant look. I'm doing fine at school. Evelyn smiled thinly. Of course you are, dear. Later that night, as Amara lay in bed, she heard footsteps outside her room. The door creaked open slightly. And Evelyn stood there, silhouetted by the hallway light. You think you're clever, don't you? Evelyn whispered, her voice low and venomous. But you're just a child. No one's going to believe you over me. Amara sat frozen, her fists clenched under the covers. Evelyn lingered for a moment, then closed the door. Amara waited until she heard Evelyn's footsteps retreat before she let out a shaky breath. She knew now more than ever that she had to act the next morning. Amara decided to confide in her school counselor. Mrs. Carter. Mrs. Carter, a kind and perceptive woman, had always encouraged Amara's artistic talents and often noticed when something was wrong. Amara, are you feeling okay? Mrs. Carter asked gently after noticing her quiet demeanor in class. Amara hesitated, then nodded. Can we talk? Privately? In Mrs. Carter's office, Amara hesitated again, unsure how to explain the situation without sounding paranoid. Finally, she said, I think my stepmother is trying to hurt my dad. I don't have all the proof yet, but I know she's planning something. Mrs. Carter's face grew serious. That's a very serious thing to say. Amara, have you talked to your father about this? He won't believe me, Amara said, her voice trembling. She's too good at pretending. But I know something's wrong. Mrs. Carter promised to keep an eye on the situation and encouraged Amara to keep speaking up. Though it didn't feel like much. Having someone listen gave Amara a glimmer of hope. Evelyn, sensing Amara's growing defiance, decided to escalate her plans. One afternoon, she cooked a lavish dinner and insisted Amara and Thomas eat together as a family. Amara's instincts screamed that something was wrong. As they sat down, Evelyn handed Thomas a glass of water. You've been working so hard lately, she said sweetly. This is for you. Stay hydrated. Amara's eyes widened as she recognized the glass, the same one she had seen Evelyn tamper with days earlier. Her heart raced as she tried to think of a way to stop him without revealing everything in front of Evelyn. Just as Thomas raised the glass to his lips, Amara stood up abruptly. Wait, she said, her voice shaking. I need to tell you something. Thomas paused, his brow furrowed. What is it, sweetheart? Amara glanced at Evelyn, who was staring at her with thinly veiled anger. I don't feel well. Can I go to my room? Thomas nodded, distracted, and set the glass down. Evelyn's smile tightened, but she said nothing as Amara left the table. In her room, Amara sat on her bed, her heart pounding. She knew she couldn't keep delaying. Whatever Evelyn was planning, she was running out of time to stop it later that night. As the house lay quiet, Amara slipped into the kitchen. The glass of water was still on the counter. Carefully, she poured its contents into a small jar and sealed it. Her plan was to take it to Mrs. Carter the next day. But as she turned to leave, she heard a voice behind her. What are you doing? Amara froze. Evelyn stood in the doorway, her face shadowed but her eyes blazing. She stepped closer, her voice cold. You've been meddling for too long. Little girl, do you really think you can stop me? Amara clutched the jar to her chest. Her breath caught in her throat. Evelyn smiled, a dangerous glint in her eye. Go ahead, run to Daddy. Let's see who he believes. As Evelyn turned and walked away, Amara realized the game had changed. This wasn't just about saving her father, it was about survival. Evelyn's mask was slipping. But her plans were moving faster than Amara anticipated. While Thomas remained oblivious, Evelyn spent her days meticulously orchestrating every detail of her scheme. She knew that to succeed, she had to eliminate the growing threat, Amara. The story unfolds with Evelyn deep in a phone call in her room. She locked the door, unaware that Amara was crouched outside, pressing her ear to the floor. I've waited long enough, Evelyn whispered. The inheritance, the house, it's all useless with him in the picture. The girl is becoming a problem too. She's watching me. Amara's stomach churned. She pieced together what Evelyn meant, the money. The house, Evelyn wanted everything. And she was willing to kill for it. Evelyn continued, her voice cold and calculating. The poison's subtle. No one will question it. Just a health complication. I'll need you to make sure it can't be traced back to me." Amara held her breath, her mind racing. She knew now that her father's life depended on her next steps. The next morning, Amara waited until Evelyn left the house for her usual errands. Quietly, she entered the kitchen, determined to find the vial Evelyn had used. She searched every cabinet, drawer, and hidden nook, her hands trembling with urgency. Finally, tucked behind the spice rack, she found a small amber vial with a faint chemical smell. The label was faded, but a single warning stood out: toxic. Not for consumption. Amara stared at the vial, her pulse pounding in her ears. This was it. This was the proof she needed. Before she could take it to her room, she heard the front door creak open. Evelyn was home earlier than expected. Panicking, Amara shoved the vial into her pocket and darted to her room. Her heart pounding as Evelyn called out, "Amara, where are you?" In her room, she examined the vial under the faint light of her desk lamp. Tears streamed down her face as the weight of the situation crushed her. She whispered to herself, "I have to stop her." Evelyn's behavior toward Amara became more overtly hostile. She no longer bothered to hide her disdain, snapping at her in front of Thomas and dismissing her concerns with mocking laughter. Thomas, ever the peacemaker, tried to smooth things over. "She's just tired, sweetheart," he told Amara one evening after Evelyn stormed out of the room. "She's under a lot of stress." But Amara couldn't shake the feeling that her father was walking straight into a trap. She decided to confront him. "Dad," she said hesitantly one evening, "do you trust Evelyn?" Thomas frowned, setting down his cup of tea. "What kind of question is that? Of course I trust her. But what if?" Amara struggled to find the words. "What if she's not who you think she is?" Thomas sighed, reaching out to ruffle her hair. "You're too young to understand. But people make mistakes. Evelyn's trying her best, just like we all are. You'll see." Amara wanted to scream, but she bit her tongue. She knew Evelyn had planted herself firmly in Thomas's trust, and breaking through would take more than words. Amara knew she had to act before it was too late. She decided to gather undeniable proof that would force Thomas to see the truth. Late one night, she crept into Evelyn's room again, her phone in hand to take photos of anything incriminating. The desk drawer was locked, but Amara remembered the spare key Evelyn often kept in her handbag. As she rifled through it, she found not only the key but another vial. This one labeled with chemical components she couldn't decipher. Using the key, she opened the drawer and found a file of documents. One was a fake insurance policy naming Evelyn as the sole beneficiary in the event of Thomas's death. Another was a receipt for the poison, dated just weeks before. Amara's hands shook as she photographed each page. Suddenly, she heard footsteps. Evelyn was awake, scrambling. Amara locked the drawer, replaced the key, and darted out of the room just as Evelyn entered. "What are you doing up?" Evelyn asked, her tone icy. I was thirsty," Amara stammered, clutching her phone tightly behind her back. Evelyn's gaze lingered on her. Suspicion etched into her face. "Go back to bed," she said sharply. Amara nodded and hurried to her room, her heart hammering in her chest. She had what she needed. Now, she just had to make sure Evelyn couldn't destroy it the next day. Amara took her phone and the vial to school, determined to show Mrs. Carter. But as she walked through the school gates, Evelyn appeared out of nowhere. Her smile strained but her grip on Amara's arm unyielding. "You forgot your lunch," Evelyn said sweetly, handing Amara a bag. Her eyes flicked to the phone sticking out of Amara's pocket. "Careful with that, you wouldn't want to lose it." Amara froze. Did Evelyn know? She felt the blood drain from her face as Evelyn leaned closer. "Have a good day, darling." The moment Evelyn left, Amara rushed to Mrs. Carter's office. She explained everything, her voice trembling as she showed the photos and the vial. Mrs. Carter's face turned pale as she listened. "This is serious, Amara," she said. "I'm going to call the authorities. But you need to be careful. Don't let her know you're onto her." Amara nodded, her resolve hardening. But when she returned home that evening, she found her phone smashed on the kitchen counter. Evelyn sat nearby, her arms crossed. "You've been very naughty, haven't you?" Evelyn said, her voice dripping with malice. "I told you not to meddle." Amara's heart sank. She had lost her evidence. And now Evelyn knew everything. The confrontation came to a head that night. Thomas returned home to find Evelyn and Amara in the middle of a heated argument. "She's lying to you," Evelyn shouted, pointing at Amara. She's been sneaking around, trying to ruin us. She's trying to hurt you. Dad, Amara yelled back. I found the poison. She's been planning this for months. Thomas looked between them, bewildered. What's going on? Evelyn burst into tears, collapsing into Thomas's arms. I've done nothing but try to help this family. And she's treating me like a monster. Amara stepped forward, her voice breaking. Dad, please, check her room. Look at her things. You'll see. Thomas hesitated. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes as he looked at Evelyn. Evelyn, he said softly. What's going on? Evelyn's tears dried instantly. Her expression hardened as she realized her web of lies was unraveling. You're taking her side? She hissed. After everything I've done for you? Thomas, shaken, stepped back. Amara wouldn't make this up. I need to know the truth. Evelyn's mask fell completely. She lunged for the vial Amara had brought back from school. But Amara grabbed it first. This is the proof, she cried, handing it to her father. Thomas stared at the vial, his face pale. What is this? Evelyn didn't wait to find out. She bolted for the door. But Thomas blocked her path. You're not going anywhere. The truth was out. Evelyn's plans had failed. But the battle wasn't over. The police were called, and Evelyn was taken into custody. But as they led her away, she turned to Amara, her eyes burning with hatred. This isn't over, she spat. You'll regret this. Amara stood tall, her father's hand on her shoulder. Not as much as you will. Evelyn's true intentions were far darker than Amara initially realized. As Amara pieced together the fragments of Evelyn's plot, she uncovered layers of manipulation. Evelyn wasn't just after the money or the house, she wanted complete control. A clean slate where Thomas and Amara didn't exist. Flashbacks revealed how Evelyn's relationship with Thomas began. She had spotted him in a cafe. A man clearly devoted to his daughter and carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. To Evelyn, he was the perfect target, vulnerable, lonely, and hardworking. Over weeks of calculated charm, she embedded herself into his life, making him believe she was his second chance at happiness. But her kindness was a facade. Evelyn had debts, mountains of them, and her desperation made her ruthless. Amara's discovery of the forged insurance policy and the poison was just the tip of the iceberg. Evelyn had carefully positioned herself as a victim of circumstances, convincing Thomas she was fragile and in need of his support. It was her way of ensuring he wouldn't question her actions. Amara's discovery of the poison marked a turning point. Holding the small amber vial in her trembling hands, she felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. She knew her father's life depended on her. But the weight of her task was immense. How could an 11-year-old stand against a woman like Evelyn? Amara's mind raced. She remembered a lesson from school about toxins and how certain substances could mimic natural causes of death. She realized Evelyn had planned the perfect crime. The poison would act slowly, making her father's death look like a heart condition. Amara felt a wave of nausea as the enormity of Evelyn's plan hit her. Desperate for answers, Amara took the vial to her room and searched for information online. Using her school tablet, she discovered that the chemical compound in the vial could cause heart failure if administered in small doses over time. Amara realized Evelyn had likely been poisoning Thomas for weeks. Gradually weakening him, the next few days were a blur of anxiety for Amara. Every time her father took a sip of water or a bite of food prepared by Evelyn, Amara's heart raced. She began intercepting meals, pretending she wanted to serve her father to ensure Evelyn didn't tamper with the food. But this only made Evelyn more suspicious. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Evelyn placed a steaming bowl of soup in front of Thomas. Amara couldn't stop herself. Dad, don't eat that, she blurted out, her voice shaking. Thomas looked at her in surprise. Amara, what's wrong? Evelyn's expression hardened. What's this about now? She asked, her tone sharp. Amara, this is getting out of hand. Apologize to your father. Amara stood her ground. You don't understand. Dad, she's trying to hurt you. Evelyn gasped, feigning shock. How dare you say that after everything I've done for this family? Thomas, caught between the two, sighed heavily. Enough, both of you. Amara, we'll talk about this later. Amara's heart sank. She realized that words alone wouldn't convince her father. She needed undeniable proof. Amara decided to gather solid evidence against Evelyn. Late one night, after Evelyn and her father went to bed, Amara sneaked into Evelyn's room. Her heart pounded as she rummaged through drawers and cabinets. She knew she was taking a huge risk if Evelyn caught her. There was no telling what she might do. In a hidden compartment of Evelyn's desk, Amara found a collection of documents. Among them was a receipt for the poison, purchased under a fake name. There was also a letter addressed to someone named Dr. Howard, thanking him for his discretion in detailing instructions for masking the poison's presence in medical reports. Amara snapped photos of everything using her school tablet. She also found a second vial of poison, this one nearly empty. Her stomach twisted as she realized her father had likely already ingested some of the poison. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she wiped them away. "I had to stop her," she whispered. As she left the room, she heard a creak behind her. Turning, she saw Evelyn standing in the doorway, her expression icy. "What are you doing in my room?" Evelyn asked, her voice low and dangerous. Amara froze, clutching the tablet behind her back. I was looking for my book." Evelyn stepped closer, her gaze piercing. "You're lying." Amara bolted past her, running to her room and locking the door. She knew she was running out of time the next day. Amara decided to show the evidence to someone who could help. She planned to visit Mrs. Carter, her school counselor, but Evelyn was one step ahead. Evelyn insisted on driving Amara to school, claiming she wanted to spend time with her. During the drive, Evelyn's tone was unusually sweet. "I know we've had our differences, Amara, but I really do care about you. I just want us to be a happy family." Amara remained silent, gripping her backpack tightly. She could feel the vial and tablet inside, the only proof she had of Evelyn's plan. When they arrived at school, Evelyn leaned over and placed a hand on Amara's shoulder. "Be careful with your things, darling. It'd be a shame if you lost something important." Amara's blood ran cold. Evelyn knew. At school, Amara rushed to Mrs. Carter's office, tears streaming down her face as she explained everything. She handed over the tablet with the photos and the vial of poison. Mrs. Carter's expression grew grim as she listened. "This is very serious, Amara," Mrs. Carter said. "I'll call the authorities, but you need to stay safe. Don't go anywhere alone." Relieved but still terrified, Amara returned home that evening. However, her relief turned to horror when she found her room ransacked. Her tablet was smashed on the floor, and the photos were gone. Evelyn stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. "I warned you not to meddle." Amara stared at her, her fear giving way to anger. "You won't get away with this." Evelyn smirked. "We'll see about that." The tension reached its peak during a family dinner. Evelyn served Thomas his favorite dish, watching closely as he prepared to take a bite. Amara, unable to stay silent any longer, shouted, "Don't eat it, Dad." Thomas froze, his fork hovering in midair. "Amara, what is this about now? She's poisoning you," Amara cried, her voice shaking. "I found the vials, the receipts, everything." Evelyn's face twisted into a mask of fury. "That's enough. You've been lying and causing trouble for weeks." Thomas looked between them, his confusion turning to doubt. "Evelyn, is this true?" Evelyn's composure cracked. "You're seriously questioning me over her? After everything I've done for you?" Amara stood her ground. "Check her room, Dad. Look at her things. You'll see." Reluctantly, Thomas followed Amara to Evelyn's room. Together, they uncovered the hidden documents and the second vial of poison. Thomas's face paled as he realized the truth. "Evelyn, how could you?" he whispered, his voice breaking. Evelyn didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed the vial and lunged toward Amara. But Thomas blocked her path. "Stay away from my daughter," he said firmly. The police were called, and Evelyn was arrested. As she was led away, she glared at Amara. "This isn't over." Amara clung to her father, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, Dad. I tried to tell you." Thomas hugged her tightly. "I'm the one who's sorry. I should have listened." As Evelyn's plot unraveled, Amara's discoveries revealed the depths of her cunning. Beyond the poison, Evelyn had meticulously created an image of herself as the victim in every possible scenario. She had written fake journal entries, portraying Amara as a rebellious child intent on breaking her father's heart. In one entry, Evelyn even accused Amara of stealing money from Thomas's wallet. Amara stumbled upon these journals one afternoon while cleaning. Leafing through the pages, her blood boiled as she read Evelyn's fabrications. It wasn't just lies, it was a calculated attempt to discredit her. "She's been building a case against me," Amara muttered to herself, her hands trembling as she flipped the pages. Evelyn wasn't just planning to kill Thomas. She was ensuring that Amara would have no one to turn to afterward. Evelyn, sensing her plan was being threatened, accelerated her timeline. Thomas began feeling fatigued, complaining of chest pains after meals. He dismissed them as work-related stress. But Amara knew better. She suspected Evelyn had already begun dosing him with poison. One night, as Thomas rested on the couch, Evelyn handed him a glass of water. Amara, sitting nearby, watched her stepmother closely. Evelyn's fingers lingered on the glass, her eyes narrowing as she passed it to Thomas. Amara acted on instinct. "Dad, wait," she shouted, grabbing the glass. The suddenness of her action startled both Thomas and Evelyn. "What's wrong with you?" Evelyn snapped, feigning shock. "It's just water." Thomas frowned, his confusion evident. "Amara, what's going on?" Amara hesitated, clutching the glass tightly. She couldn't outright accuse Evelyn without solid proof. I thought I saw something in it," she said, her voice trembling. Evelyn's expression hardened. "You're being ridiculous," she said with a forced laugh. "Thomas, you need to talk to her. This behavior is getting out of hand." Amara's heart sank as she saw the doubt in her father's eyes. She knew she was running out of time. Amara realized she couldn't fight Evelyn alone. She needed an ally, someone who could help her expose the truth. Turning to Mrs. Carter again seemed too risky, as Evelyn's watchful eye made it nearly impossible for Amara to leave the house undetected. Instead, she sought the help of her neighbor, Mrs. Green, an elderly woman who had always been kind to her. Mrs. Green welcomed Amara into her home one evening, sensing the urgency in the young girl's voice. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Amara hesitated, then spilled everything: Evelyn's poison, the fake documents, her father's worsening condition. Mrs. Green listened intently, her face growing more serious with each word. "We need to act quickly," Mrs. Green said. "I know someone who can test that vial for you. Bring it here." Amara nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope. That night, she retrieved the vial from its hiding place and handed it to Mrs. Green, who promised to get it analyzed by a trusted friend. For the first time, Amara felt like she wasn't completely alone. Evelyn's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She began monitoring Amara's every move, questioning her whenever she left the house or spent time alone in her room. One evening, Evelyn cornered Amara in the kitchen. "You've been acting strange lately," she said, her voice dangerously low. "Is there something you want to tell me?" Amara stood her ground, her heart pounding. "No, I just don't like you." Evelyn smirked, leaning closer. "Careful, little girl, you don't want to make me your enemy." Amara stared back, refusing to show fear. "You already are." Evelyn's smile faded. For a brief moment, her true nature surfaced, a cold, ruthless predator. "You'll regret this," she hissed before storming out of the room. Amara knew the confrontation had only escalated the stakes. Evelyn wouldn't stop until her plan was complete, determined to get her father out of the house. Amara concocted a plan. She pretended to plan a surprise outing for Thomas, convincing him to take the day off work. She hoped to get him far away from Evelyn and buy time for Mrs. Green's contact to confirm the poison's presence. On the morning of the outing, Evelyn intervened. "Where are you going?" she asked Thomas, her tone laced with suspicion. "Amara said she planned something for us," Thomas replied, confused but amused. Evelyn's eyes darted to Amara. "How sweet," she said, forcing a smile. "But Thomas, don't you remember? We have an appointment today. It's important." Amara's heart sank. Evelyn was lying, but she couldn't prove it. Reluctantly, Thomas canceled the outing, leaving Amara feeling defeated. Later that day, Evelyn confronted Amara. "You thought you could outsmart me?" she taunted. "Stay out of my way, or you'll regret it." That evening, Mrs. Green called. "It's poison, Amara," she said. "Your stepmother's been giving your father a slow-acting toxin. We need to involve the police." Amara felt a mix of relief and dread. She had the proof, but confronting Evelyn directly was dangerous. She decided to wait until Thomas returned home from work to tell him everything. When Thomas arrived, Amara mustered her courage. "Dad, I need to talk to you. It's about Evelyn." "What is it now, sweetheart?" Thomas asked, weary from the constant tension in the house. Before Amara could explain, Evelyn entered the room. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice sugary sweet but her eyes full of suspicion. Amara turned to her father. She's poisoning you. Dad, I have proof. Thomas stared at her, stunned. Amara, that's a serious accusation. She's lying. Evelyn interrupted, her voice rising. This child has been trying to ruin our family since the beginning. No, I'm not, Amara shouted. Mrs. Green had the poison tested. It's real. Dad, she's been giving it to you. Evelyn's facade cracked, her voice dropped, and her expression turned icy. You little brat, she snarled, lunging toward Amara. Thomas stepped between them, his face pale but resolute. That's enough, he said. Evelyn, what have you done? Evelyn's mask finally fell. You were supposed to trust me, she screamed. I did everything for us. For this life, and now you're going to throw it all away because of her? Thomas shook his head, his voice shaking. I trusted you, Evelyn, but I can't ignore this. The sound of sirens filled the air as Mrs. Green, having called the police, arrived with the authorities. Evelyn tried to flee, but Thomas stopped her. You're not going anywhere. As the officers led Evelyn away, she turned to Amara, her eyes filled with hatred. You think you've won, but this isn't over. Amara stood frozen, her father's arm around her shoulders. It is over, Thomas said firmly, his voice steady despite the heartbreak in his eyes. The house felt hollow after Evelyn's arrest. Her presence, once suffocating, had left a vacuum that Amara and her father struggled to fill. Thomas spent hours in silence, replaying the events in his mind, while Amara kept busy organizing her thoughts, her drawings, and her emotions. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Thomas finally spoke. I failed you, sweetheart, he said, his voice heavy with regret. I should have protected you from her. Amara shook her head, her voice trembling. You didn't fail me, Dad. You're here, and that's what matters. We're safe now. Thomas looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and pride. You're braver than I ever gave you credit for. But the shadow of Evelyn's actions lingered. Thomas had started to experience panic attacks, waking in the middle of the night, clutching his chest, fearing the poison might still be in his system. Amara would stay up with him, holding his hand, promising they would get through it together. The courtroom was a battlefield of truth and lies. Evelyn, dressed immaculately as if attending a tea party, sat with an air of defiance. Her lawyer painted her as a misunderstood stepmother, vilified by an imaginative child and a grieving husband. But Amara had her proof. Taking the stand was the most daunting moment of her life. She recounted every detail, finding the poison, overhearing Evelyn's conversations, and the moments of fear that haunted her. The prosecutor supported her with the chemical analysis from Mrs. Green's contact, confirming that the poison had been administered in small doses over weeks. Evelyn's mask finally cracked during cross-examination. When asked why she had purchased the poison, she faltered, her carefully rehearsed lies crumbling. It was, for pests, she stammered, but the prosecutor pressed on, presenting evidence of her forged documents and insurance schemes. Thomas also took the stand, his testimony a mix of heartbreak and disbelief. I trusted her with my family, he said, his voice breaking. I never thought someone I loved could be capable of such evil. The trial stretched for weeks, with the defense attempting to discredit Amara's account by highlighting her age and the tensions between stepmother and stepdaughter. But Amara's courage and consistency won over the jury. When the verdict was read, guilty on all charges, Evelyn's composure finally shattered. She screamed as the bailiffs escorted her out, her threats echoing in the courtroom. You'll regret this, Amara. Both of you will. Amara gripped her father's hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. Justice had been served, but the scars remained. The weeks following the trial were a time of reflection and rebuilding. Thomas decided to take time off work, dedicating himself to repairing his relationship with Amara and processing the betrayal he had suffered. They spent more time together, rediscovering the simple joys they had lost in the chaos Evelyn had created. One afternoon, Thomas surprised Amara with a visit to an art studio in the city. I know how much you love drawing, he said. I thought maybe you'd like to take some classes. Amara's face lit up. Really? Really? Thomas said, smiling for the first time in weeks. You've been so strong, sweetheart. It's time you get to be a kid again. Amara threw her arms around him, her heart swelling with gratitude. The classes became a sanctuary for her, a place where she could channel her emotions and find peace. At the same time, Thomas began attending therapy, Encouraged by Mrs. Green, he knew he needed help to process the guilt and anxiety that lingered after Evelyn's betrayal. Slowly, he began to heal, learning to forgive himself and focus on the future. One evening, as they sat together in the backyard, Amara brought out a box of old photos. Among them were pictures of her mother, Lila. Amara hesitated before handing one to her father. "Do you ever think about her?" she asked softly. Thomas studied the photo, a wistful smile on his face. "I do. She gave me you, and for that, I'll always be grateful." Amara nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "Do you think she misses us?" Thomas sighed. "Maybe, but sometimes, people make choices that take them far away. It doesn't mean they didn't love us. It just means they weren't ready." Amara leaned into her father, finding comfort in his words. For the first time, she felt a sense of closure about her mother's absence. Her family wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and that was enough. Months later, life had found a new rhythm. The house felt lighter, filled with laughter and love. Amara's drawings adorned the walls, a testament to her growth and resilience. Thomas had returned to work, but with a renewed sense of purpose. He had started mentoring younger mechanics, finding fulfillment in helping others. One day, a letter arrived from the prison where Evelyn was serving her sentence. Thomas hesitated before opening it. The letter was filled with bitterness and accusations, blaming Amara for everything that had gone wrong in Evelyn's life. Thomas burned the letter without a second thought. "She doesn't get to take any more from us," he said firmly. Amara watched him, her heart swelling with pride. They had come so far, and nothing Evelyn said could undo their progress. Years later, Amara stood in an art gallery, her first exhibition on display. Her work, a blend of vibrant colors and haunting shadows, told the story of her journey of pain, courage, and healing. Thomas stood by her side, his pride evident as he introduced her to visitors. One painting, titled "The Glass of Water," drew particular attention. It depicted a hand reaching out, poised to stop something unseen but deadly. It was a tribute to the moment Amara had taken control of her fate and saved her father's life. As the evening wore on, Amara and Thomas walked home together, the cool night air wrapping around them. "You've come so far," Thomas said, his voice full of emotion. "So have you," Amara replied, smiling. Their bond, forged in love and tempered by trials, had survived the darkest of times. Together, they had built a new life, one filled with hope, resilience, and the unshakable knowledge that they could face anything. As long as they had each other. The days immediately following Evelyn's sentencing were surreal. The house, though now quiet and free of tension, felt foreign to Amara and her father. The emptiness served as a constant reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. Thomas struggled with guilt, while Amara wrestled with lingering fear. Thomas spent hours going through their home, removing every trace of Evelyn, her clothes, her belongings, even the decorative items she had chosen. All were boxed up and discarded. It was as if he was trying to cleanse the house of her influence. To reclaim their space, Amara watched silently, knowing her father needed this ritual to heal. One afternoon, Thomas found a hidden stash of items Evelyn had kept, photographs of Amara defaced with angry scribbles, notes detailing her plans to isolate Thomas from his daughter. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands shaking as he read them. Amara placed a comforting hand on his arm. "It wasn't your fault, Dad," she said softly. "She fooled both of us." Thomas looked at her, his eyes filled with tears. "I should have seen it sooner. I should have protected you." Amara hugged him tightly, her voice steady. "You did protect me. You believed me when it mattered." The trial wasn't just about Evelyn's guilt, it was a test of Amara's strength and resolve. The defense lawyer was relentless, attempting to paint Amara as an overimaginative child with a grudge against her stepmother. They dissected her every action, questioning her motives and trying to discredit her testimony. Amara's heart pounded as she took the stand, her small hands gripping the edges of the witness box. The courtroom felt enormous, filled with strangers who stared at her as if waiting for her to crumble. But she didn't. She held her head high and told her story. "When I found the poison, I knew I had to do something," Amara said, her voice trembling but clear. "I was scared, but I couldn't let her hurt my dad." The prosecutor guided her through her testimony, showing the photos she had taken of Evelyn's documents and the vial of poison. Amara watched the jury closely, noting their horrified expressions as the evidence mounted. When it was Evelyn's turn to testify, she was a picture of false sincerity. "I loved this family," she said, her voice heavy with mock emotion. "I tried my best to be a good stepmother. But Amara never accepted me. She made up these lies to drive us apart." Thomas, sitting beside his lawyer, clenched his fists. He wanted to shout the truth, but he knew the evidence would speak louder than words. The prosecutor dismantled Evelyn's facade piece by piece, revealing her lies and inconsistencies. When asked about the poison, Evelyn faltered. "It was for pests," she said weakly. "Pests in a locked drawer in your bedroom?" the prosecutor countered, his voice sharp. The turning point came when the forensic expert confirmed that traces of the poison had been found in Thomas's blood. The jury's faces darkened, and Evelyn's mask of innocence finally cracked after the trial. Amara and Thomas embarked on a journey of healing. It wasn't easy. There were nights when Thomas woke up drenched in sweat, haunted by nightmares of Evelyn's betrayal. Amara, too, struggled with anxiety, jumping at small noises and finding it difficult to trust people. They began attending therapy together, a decision that helped them process their trauma. In their sessions, they learned how to communicate openly, sharing feelings they had both kept buried for years. For Thomas, it was the guilt of bringing Evelyn into their lives. For Amara, it was the pain of feeling unheard and powerless. One day, during the therapy session, Amara shared something she had never told her father. "I thought about running away," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think anyone would believe me." Thomas's heart broke at her words. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I never want you to feel like you have to face things alone." From that day forward, their bond grew stronger. They began finding joy in the little things, cooking dinner together, playing board games, and taking long walks in the park. Slowly, the house transformed from a place of fear to a haven of love and safety. Amara's thoughts often drifted to her mother, Lila. Though the pain of her absence had dulled over time, it still lingered like an old scar. One evening, as she and her father sorted through old family photos, Amara came across a picture of Lila holding her as a baby. Her mother's smile was radiant, her arms protective. "Do you think she thinks about us?" Amara asked, her voice tentative. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "I think so. But sometimes, people make choices they can't undo. It doesn't mean they didn't love you, it just means they couldn't stay." Amara stared at the photo, tears welling in her eyes. "I used to hate her for leaving. It's okay to feel that way," Thomas said gently. "But holding on to that anger won't change the past. All we can do is focus on what we have now." Amara nodded, feeling a sense of closure. Her mother's absence had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. The final step in their healing came when Thomas decided to move. The house, though filled with memories, carried too much pain. Together, he and Amara found a small, cozy home closer to her art studio. Packing up the old house was bittersweet. As they boxed up their belongings, they found traces of their lives before Evelyn, Amara's childhood drawings, Thomas's collection of classic car magazines, and even a dusty box of toys Amara thought she had lost. Their new home was a fresh start. Amara's room was filled with her art supplies and sketches, while Thomas transformed the garage into a workshop for his hobbies. They created new traditions, like Sunday morning pancakes and weekly movie nights. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Thomas turned to Amara. "You know, you saved my life," he said. Amara smiled, her heart full. "We saved each other." Years later, Amara stood in front of an audience at her first art exhibition. Her work, a mixture of vivid colors and haunting imagery, told the story of her journey. One piece, titled "The House That Wasn't a Home," depicted a shadowy figure looming over a family, the colors shifting from darkness to light. As she spoke about her art, she caught sight of her father in the crowd, his pride shining brighter than any spotlight. After the event, they walked home together, reminiscing about how far they had come. "Do you ever think about Evelyn?" Amara asked. "Sometimes," Thomas admitted, "but only to remind myself how strong we are now." Amara nodded, her heart light. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, their bond unshakable. Together, they had built a life filled with love, hope, and the promise of a brighter future. The aftermath of Evelyn's removal wasn't the clean break Amara and Thomas hoped it would be. Though Evelyn was gone, Her manipulation left scars. Thomas struggled with deep guilt, questioning his judgment and his ability to protect his family. One evening, Thomas sat on the edge of his bed, holding a small picture frame containing a photo of himself and Evelyn on their wedding day. His expression was a mix of sorrow and self-reproach. "Why didn't I see it?" he muttered aloud. Amara, passing by his room, overheard him. She hesitated before stepping inside. "Dad, it's not your fault," she said softly, sitting beside him. "She fooled us both." Thomas shook his head. "I was supposed to protect you. I let her into our home. And she nearly..." His voice broke. Amara reached out, placing her hand over his. "You did protect me, when it mattered most. You believed me. That's what counts." This moment became a turning point for Thomas. With Amara's support, he began to let go of the guilt, replacing it with a renewed determination to rebuild their lives. The trial revealed more than just Evelyn's crimes. It became a stage where the complexity of human nature was on full display. Journalists covered the case extensively, sensationalizing every detail. Headlines read, "Stepmother's Betrayal," "A Family's Nightmare," and "Brave Child Exposes Murderous Plot." Amara found herself the subject of public fascination. Some praised her bravery, while others questioned the authenticity of her story. Strangers whispered in the courtroom, their eyes flickering between her and Evelyn. During cross-examination, Evelyn's lawyer attempted to undermine Amara's testimony. "You're very young, aren't you, Miss Thomas?" he asked, his tone condescending. "I'm 11, Amara replied firmly, meeting his gaze. "And 11-year-olds have active imaginations, don't they? Isn't it possible you misinterpreted what you saw?" Amara's hands tightened around the edges of the witness stand, but her voice didn't waver. "I know what I saw. And I know what she did." The lawyer smirked. No further questions. Afterward, Thomas held Amara close. "You were amazing up there," he said, his voice filled with pride. Amara nodded, though the weight of the experience lingered. Being thrust into the public eye felt overwhelming, but she was determined to see it through as the trial neared its conclusion. Evelyn was given a chance to address the court. Her polished demeanor returned, her voice trembling with rehearsed emotion. "I made mistakes," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "But I never wanted to hurt anyone. I was overwhelmed, trying to hold this family together. Amara misunderstood my intentions." Her words were met with silence. Thomas shook his head, disgusted by her attempts to manipulate the court one final time. The prosecutor, however, was ready. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said during his closing arguments, "this is not a case of misunderstanding. This is a calculated attempt to murder a man and destroy the life of a child. Do not let her crocodile tears cloud the truth." The jury deliberated for hours before delivering the verdict. "Guilty." Evelyn's face twisted with rage as the sentence was read. She turned to Amara and Thomas, her voice venomous. "This isn't over. You'll pay for this." Amara leaned into her father, her voice steady. "She can't hurt us anymore." Healing wasn't linear. Both Amara and Thomas faced setbacks as they adjusted to life without Evelyn's shadow looming over them. Amara developed a habit of double-checking the locks at night, her fear of being unsafe lingering long after Evelyn's departure. One night, as she sat on the couch sketching, Thomas joined her. "Can't sleep?" he asked. Amara shook her head. "I keep thinking, what if she gets out? What if she tries to come back?" Thomas placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "She won't, and even if she tried, we'd be ready. We're stronger now." To help Amara cope, Thomas enrolled her in self-defense classes. At first, Amara was hesitant, feeling awkward and out of place. But as the weeks passed, she grew more confident. Each punch, kick, and block became a way for her to reclaim her sense of security. For Thomas, therapy became a lifeline. During one session, he opened up about the moment he realized Evelyn's betrayal. "It felt like my whole world collapsed," he admitted, "but seeing Amara's strength gave me hope." His therapist nodded. "Sometimes, our children teach us how to be brave." Amara's art blossomed in the months following the trial. She poured her emotions into her work, creating pieces that reflected both her pain and her resilience. Her art teacher noticed her talent and encouraged her to enter a local competition. Amara hesitated at first. "What if no one likes my work?" she asked Thomas. "People will love it," he replied, his confidence unwavering. "But even if they don't, what matters is that it's yours." Amara submitted a piece titled, "The Breaking Point." The painting depicted a glass of water, its surface rippling with tension, a hand poised to stop it from tipping over. The symbolism was clear. The fragile moment when she saved her father's life. When the painting won first prize, Amara beamed with pride. The recognition wasn't just about her talent, it was a validation of her journey. Amara's thoughts occasionally returned to her mother, Lila. With Thomas's encouragement, she decided to write a letter, pouring out years of unspoken feelings. "Dear Mom," she began, her pen trembling in her hand. "I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I wanted to tell you what's happened in my life." The letter was cathartic, allowing Amara to process the pain of her mother's absence. Whether or not she received a response, she felt a sense of closure. Thomas, too, reached out to old friends and family members he had distanced himself from during his time with Evelyn. Slowly, they began rebuilding their support network, finding strength in connections they had once taken for granted. As time passed, Amara and Thomas found themselves laughing more, the weight of their ordeals slowly lifting. They celebrated milestones, Amara's first art sale, Thomas's promotion at work, with a newfound appreciation for life's simple joys. One sunny afternoon, Thomas surprised Amara with a road trip to the countryside. "I thought we could use a change of scenery," he said with a grin. The trip was filled with laughter, exploration, and moments of quiet reflection. Sitting by a lake, Amara sketched the landscape while Thomas read a book. It was a picture of peace, a stark contrast to the chaos they had endured. "I think we're going to be okay," Amara said, her voice filled with quiet certainty. Thomas smiled. "I know we will." Years later, Amara stood in front of a packed auditorium, accepting an award for her contributions to the art world. Her work, celebrated for its raw emotion and storytelling, had touched countless lives. In her acceptance speech, she said, "Art gave me a voice when I felt powerless. It helped me heal and reminded me that even in our darkest moments, there's light waiting to be found." Thomas, sitting in the audience, wiped away a tear. He had watched his daughter grow into a resilient, compassionate woman, and he couldn't have been prouder. As they walked out of the auditorium that night, Amara looked up at the stars, her heart full. The shadows of the past no longer haunted her, they had shaped her into who she was. But they no longer defined her. Together, she and her father had reclaimed their lives, proving that love, courage, and hope could overcome even the darkest of trials.